Great. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for having me. I was advertised as being recorded, but I am live. So whatever comes out of my mouth is going to come out of my mouth. And there's nothing they can do about it. I'm delighted to be here to talk about these issues. And what I want to provide as general context is uh, I am a psychologist by training, and the research interests from my lab are about the gap between values and practices, what we think we should do, what we want to, what we're trying to do, versus what we actually do in our everyday behavior. And the work that we do through the Center for Open Science is related very strongly to the goals of this workshop, which is trying to address the gap between scientific values and scientific practices, how we idealize research to operate versus how it actually operates in everyday behavior. And so I'll start with the conclusion, which is that researchers' responsible conduct of research is constrained by their own minds and the limitations of insight and control that they have on their own, enacting their own intentions in their behavior, and the social system in which they're embedded, that then reinforces some of the biasing influences that our minds bring to the table outside of what we might intend to do in line with our values. And then the solution for effective responsible conduct of research requires attention to the systems level of how it is that these things operate, how the system creates and constrains what we as individuals do within that system. And we can't just rely on knowing what the right thing to do is and having good intentions to do it. Both of those may be present, and I can still fail to meet the values that the system has for me or that I have for myself in conducting my research responsibly and ethically. So let me begin with a very brief review of the constraints on the mind. Our minds have a very big challenge for understanding the world around them, right? There's the world outside, and then there's our brains inside our skulls. And the only way that we have to get information about what's out there, to understanding what it is and what we can do about it, is through our sensory systems: sight, hearing, touch, taste. Those sensory systems send electrical and chemical information that gets reconstructed in our mind into some kind of representation of what's out there for us to make decisions about, make judgments, decide how it is that we're going to do our next steps. The challenge is that reality and that perception of reality that our mind constructs are not the same thing. And it is the mechanisms that help us generate an understanding of what's happening out in the world that help us to deal with uncertainty and incomplete information and stuff that doesn't quite fit, but also then impose things on us that might lead us away from our intentions, our values, or our goals for accuracy. And this is just one visual illustration to show how reality and our perception of reality are not the same thing. So it is obvious looking at this checkerboard that the squares labeled A and B are different shades of gray. But that's actually not true. They are in fact the same shade of gray. And I'll show you that just by moving the shading of A down over B, like this. And you can see that they are the same. Now, of course, you say, wait, but it changed as it was moving. I'll just do it again so you can see it apparently changing, but it's not changing. These two are, in fact, the same shade of gray. And this is a stunning illusion because looking at it, it is so obvious that they are different shades of gray, and yet they're not. And so there are two things to take very briefly out of this as an illustration. The first is that the context around those squares labeled A and B fundamentally alters our perception of them. We are making interpretations based on the checkerboard, based on the shading from the cylinder, and we don't know that we're making all of those interpretations. We don't recognize that those adjustments are being made. They're being made for us by the systems in our mind that are efficiently dealing with this challenge of perception, of how do we translate information from outside and then impose interpretations based on our background, our experience, things we know about the world, our theories about how the world works, to come up with a coherent perception. So all of that is happening for us, which is great for efficiency, but then can lead to this perception that is wrong in one sense, and we can't see it otherwise. And the second challenge is that knowing that those are the same shade of gray, now that we know that, our perception doesn't update. We don't now see them as the same shade of gray. They still look different. And that's because our perception is not subject to reason. We don't get to decide how we perceive the world. We have a variety of automatic, unconscious processes that provide that experience after it's been filtered through lots and lots of information. And the shocking part about what we know so far about our minds is that a lot of our general reasoning is subject to those same kinds of constraints. Biases that influence how we understand, consume information, understand each other, that can lead us away from accuracy and often be influenced by things for what we want to be true, what's in our interest to be true, and all kinds of bias and influences that get in the way of living by our values. So if there's other questions about the perception side, I'm happy to talk about that some other time, but I just want to make that basic point about the constraints on our own minds in trying to live according to our values. Here's another way just to get rid of the illusion as you connect them together. So this is online. You can find Ed Adelson's work and many more like this. So that's the individual. That individual also exists in a system. And within research, that system has a number of different agents that shape what is valued, what is rewarded, what is incentivized, what is required of us in doing our work, what we're likely to do to advance in our careers and to be able to have the occupations. And all of those elements of the system play a fundamental role in driving behavior in ways that we can recognize, we can see how it's influencing us, and in ways that we can't. And that's where a lot of the core challenges are for RCR. For us, that challenge consolidates to one core issue, which is the incentives for my success in research are focused on me getting it published, not on me getting it right. Like Tina was saying in the prior discussion, most researchers get into science because they want to do good work. They want to find truthful things, right? I'm not in research to write papers or write grants. I'm in research because I'm curious about things. I want to discover stuff. I like solving problems. I like the challenge of the unknown and seeing how far we can push it out. But there's also the reality of how do I have, maintain, and thrive in the career. And those aren't necessarily reinforced by the same behaviors. Some things are more publishable than other things. I'm more publishable if I get positive results rather than negative results. If I get novel results rather than replicate some prior findings. When my findings are neat and tidy and fit together rather than things that don't quite work. And because of that driving incentive, publication being the currency of reward, there are a variety of things that emerge as a consequence of that cultural constraint on things that I'm likely to do by intention or unintentionally, right? Selective reporting. We do many experiments. Some of them don't quite work out for the hypotheses we have. I can easily rationalize why the findings that didn't work were actually bad studies. I shouldn't report them at all. And I don't think that the reviewers would even want to see them anyway. So why bother reporting them? There are many ways that I could analyze the data for this particular finding. Some of them make it more publishable than other ways I might analyze it. I might rationalize to myself without even realizing I do it to choose the ways that look better for publication, even if fundamentally they reduce the credibility of those findings. Of course, transparency and sharing are core values in science, but I'm not rewarded for those things. That doesn't matter for the publishability of my outcomes. So why would I bother spending the time making data available, sharing materials? And certainly, why would I bother replicating other people's findings or my own if replication itself is considered boring and not career advancing? So those proximal behaviors that I might do in my work then lead to system level challenges. The credibility of the published literature suffers as a consequence. We don't have what we idealize as science being self-corrective and constantly challenging and being skeptical of our own and each other's claims to see what survives. And all of that leads to friction in the pace of discovery, of trying to do what we're here to do. So I want to tackle 4 barriers with examples of solutions just to seed the kinds of discussion of how we can think about systems level approaches that then address some of these individual challenges of the fact that I have skin in the game. Certain kinds of outcomes are better for my career, given what the system demands of me. And so how can I enable myself to be both rewarded for the good behaviors, but then also avoid some of those biasing influences that might change how it is I approach my work and others being able to critique that work. One barrier is that the current system operates with minimal accountability. You don't know what happens in my lab. All you get to see at the end is my report, the paper that we write of how we characterize what we did. Of course, David Donahoe said that the paper really is advertising for the research, not the research itself. So if we want to have science living by this sense of accountability by sharing ideas and evidence into the marketplace, we really need to expand our notion of what it is that needs to be shared. What is the actual content of the research? And of course, that's more inclusive of the protocol, the methodology, the materials that were used to execute the work, and the data that was generated as a consequence of that procedure and methodology, in addition to the paper that summarizes my perception of what's important to know. Just making that more available to others creates an environment where self-correction is possible. It's not possible to self-correct if you can't see how it is that I got to the findings. You might be skeptical of them, but I'm just telling you, that's what I found. And whatever it is I report is all the information you have. If you can actually see how it is the research was conducted and the data was generated, then your skeptical response can address more specifically what it is that was done in the work and whether your skepticism is justified or not. In addition to all those opportunities to make it easier to replicate somebody else's work, easier to extend and combine data, and other virtues of sharing. The minimal one is, if I know that you could look, then that changes my orientation to, if I were observing someone else doing the research this way, would I think it's credible, right? That perspective taking can change my approach to how it is I would do my work. And even if I don't do that perspective taking, the system now can provide some self-corrective mechanism by you being able to see how it is I did my work. Okay, second barrier is all of that motivated reasoning, right? I have these amazing frontal lobes that can rationalize any kind of behavior that's in my self-interest as being the right thing to do, because I have flexibility in how I reason and rationalize based on the current context. And that applies in science as much as it does in every other part of our lives, right? Some examples of motivated reasoning: confirmation bias, right? I get an initial finding that's exciting. It's going to be really publishable. It's going to advance my career and my research program. I am likely to orient how it is I conduct my subsequent research to confirm that initial exciting finding rather than challenge it. That's a natural response and hard to avoid. Right? Hindsight bias. Once I observe a finding, whoa, that's amazing. We didn't expect it, but now that I've seen it, I can make it make perfect sense and develop a story as if that was what we expected all along, as fits into a nice theory, and present it, given the reward systems, in a package that does not appreciate its increased uncertainty as having happened by accident, as a discovery. Those discoveries are super important, but they're also, we need to calibrate our confidence in them because they're often made contingent on the data rather than a priori tests with the data. So one mechanism of reducing motivated reasoning is pre-registration. If I have to say in advance, here's the study that I'm going to do, then if I only report one of the 10 experiments that I did in the paper, you can at least say, well, what's up with the other 9? Why didn't you include those? And I might have great reasons why I didn't include them, but at least you can then evaluate, are those really not effective tests and only the one is the relevant one? The second thing is that by pre-registering those studies in advance, we know very clearly what was expected and then what was discovered after the fact. So the analyses that I plan, the things that I was hoping to investigate are clear. And sometimes it'll be, well, I don't really have any expectations. I'm wading into something that's brand new. This is a very exploratory area of research. But by making that explicit, then that can help calibrate the confidence in the findings that are reported after the fact, that may then, over a course of a program of research, turn from exploratory discovery, highly uncertain, to a pretty specific set of hypotheses and explanations that can be tested directly in a subsequent data set. So by helping with pre-registration, having clear what's planned and what's unplanned, can then help with me after the fact realizing, oh, that wasn't actually what I had thought was going to happen. I need to report that as in a more exploratory basis because of that hindsight bias and the ability for me to convince myself, oh, I knew that all along, rather than recognizing that it was a violation of expectations. Here is some direct evidence that pre-registration can reduce motivated reasoning and start to address some of the challenges in bias toward positive results, for example, in the published literature. This is a study comparing registered reports that builds in pre-registration into the peer review process. And a journal commits to publishing this particular study with this design as long as the researchers follow what they said they were going to do, regardless of the outcome. So also the journal doesn't know what the outcomes are going to be yet. This is a special case of pre-registration more generally. And what is shown here is that a comparison of registered reports where commitment to publish is made before anybody knows what the results are going to be has a positive result rate supporting the hypotheses under 50% in this sample. And a comparison set of articles from the same journals published around the same time has more than 90% of those findings showed evidence consistent with the hypothesis. Standard reports, of course, are ones that we report after the fact. We already know what the outcomes are, and we either may be adjusting our hypotheses to fit the outcomes, or we may be selectively reporting only those outcomes that are consistent with our hypotheses. The pre-commitment eliminates the opportunity to do that and makes more visible how it is we reason with whatever findings we observe, so that we are responsive to the evidence as it comes, rather than changing the nature of what we see as the evidence based on what's in it for us in terms of publishability. Okay, third barrier is perceived norms. What's amazing about the research on scientific values is that there is almost universal endorsement for the things that we would identify as core values of science. Right? This one is drawing on Merton's norms of science, and in gray are the proportion of respondents who endorse norms like transparency over secrecy, self-skepticism over dogmatism, a focus on quality rather than over on quantity. And almost everyone says, yeah, that's how science should operate, is according to those norms, not those counter norms. And then when you ask them, do you live by those? Still, most people say that they live by the norms. And you can see in black, a very small proportion say, no, I live by secrecy and dogmatism and just trying to get as many papers as possible. And then when you say, okay, don't tell me how you behave, tell me how others in your field, how do they behave? It totally reverses. And what's shocking about this is that it's the same people, right? The 3,300 respondents in this, in the first bars are the people of the research community saying that, yes, collectively, we each individually endorse the norms of science. And then at the bottom, yes, we collectively, individually perceive that each other does not, or at least if each other does, the culture does not reinforce those values and norms of science. They really, in fact, favor the counter norms, secrecy, dogmatism, quantity over quality, etc. So the challenge here is that the norm already exists in people's values. It is not manifest in the culture. And so while that's a big challenge and problem, right? This is a definition of a dysfunctional culture. Everybody has one set of values and almost nobody sees that the culture aligns with those values. this does present an opportunity to change it. And the easiest way to change it is to make visible those desired behaviors. People don't see each other behaving according to the values that they hold. So if we can increase the visibility of when people are doing those behaviors that are valued, then that can very rapidly shift the norms in a community. Oh, I see now that people are doing it. So maybe I was wrong about the culture being so against things like better transparency. And so these can be implemented, for example, as badges, where journals increase the visibility of when data or materials are shared or when the studies were pre-registered, so that readers can see, oh, other authors in my community are doing these behaviors. And just to illustrate the impact of that kind of simple intervention of visibility, the journal Psychological Science in black here adopted badges on January 1st, 2014. What I'm showing you here is the 2 years prior of what proportion of articles had reported sharing data in Psych Science in black and in 4 comparison journals in gray. Badges were implemented January 1st, 2014, and over the next 18 months, the proportion of articles in Psych Science that had open data went to 40%. That's in 2015. If you look in the last year, it's more than 80% of articles now in Psychological Science have open data. And it's not because the badge is some amazing reward, it isn't. But the badge is a signal of norms in that community. And the great thing about norms is as soon as they start to accumulate, right? Some people are doing the behavior, others recognize it's a desired behavior, more of them start to do that behavior. And the fact that more are starting to do the behavior, if it's visible, even more will be likely to do the behavior. So for valued behaviors, they can spread very quickly. All right, I am at time, so let me do the last barrier very briefly. And that is, I'm busy, so are you. So is every other researcher. And this is an unappreciated, but a huge barrier to adopting rigor, transparency, and integrity improving behaviors. It's because there's just a lot to do. And one of the key things that we have to do, and Tina raised this in the last presentation, is you have to meet researchers where they are. If you don't provide tools and resources and ways for people to translate the concepts and the actions concretely, actionably into their everyday behavior, it's going to be very hard to take abstract principles of, oh yeah, I recognize those are things are for integrity, and then have them integrated into that researcher's daily workflow, where their focus is not on what are my higher order principles. Their focus is on how do I get this work done? How do I solve the problems I'm trying to solve in the research? And so there's a need to increasingly adapt how we conduct interventions for responsible conduct of research that are embedded in the context in which the researchers are doing their work. And I think Dina Plemons will probably, if she hasn't talked about it already, we'll probably talk about that some tomorrow in some of these embedded approaches to improving research integrity. So I want to stop there so there's some time for questions and conversation. I want to provide some links here to some of the things relevant to stuff that I just talked about. And also these slides are available. You see the link at the bottom. You're welcome to get them, use them, remix them, do anything you want with them. They are open. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. I'll just jump to a question that is showing up in the Q&A. And if there's some moderator that wants to intervene, feel free to intervene on me. I'm just going to keep on talking. The question is, can you please comment on the bias against publishing no results and how that affects everything you talked about? That's a very important one. It is fundamental in some of that favoring of certain kinds of results over others. And the interesting thing about the evidence about lack of publishing no results is that everyone in the system is contributing to that. So my colleague, Tony Greenwald, in 1975, he has a paper that's called Prejudice Against the Null Hypothesis. And it's a great paper because he basically outlines the challenge. And this is, now more than 45 years ago, where he, through surveying researchers about how they plan their research and make reports, how researchers themselves end up failing to report null results and the consequences of that for the credibility of the findings that they report. And from his estimation at that time, not talking about anything in terms of questionable research practices or other kinds of things that would be misconduct or more mild forms of behavior that reduce credibility, he estimated that just that researcher themselves not reporting null results because they don't think they would be published leads to about 35% of the published findings being unlikely to be reproducible, being more likely to be false positive results, simply because of that challenge. So this is a real fundamental part of the challenge. And one of the solutions of registered reports that I mentioned briefly, where the journal has its peer review prior to it even knowing the outcomes, is to entirely eliminate bias against null results. Null results get published because the commitment is made for the importance of the research question and the quality of the methodology to test it prior to knowing the outcomes. And so all outcomes end up getting reported. And I could talk a lot more about that if you're interested. Oh, another question comes in through Q&A. Can you talk about the use of registered results for research that arguably should be considered exploratory? Great question. There's a ton of exploratory research, and diminishing the emphasis on exploratory research would be dangerous. If we did all confirmatory research, we're only testing pre-existing hypotheses, we would severely limit discovery, which whereas a lot of the big leaps occur in science. There are a couple of answers with how registered reports integrate with exploratory research. The first is that it offers an opportunity to be more explicit about when research is actually exploratory versus when it's confirmatory. One of the problematic aspects of the research culture is that calling something exploratory is seen as undermining the value of research, which is crazy because we all recognize that exploratory work is important. And so we're incentivized to write papers as if we have a whole theoretical context, or it was planned, or we predicted this, and all of these other things that dress up what is an exploratory finding as a confirmatory finding. And that is consequential for the credibility of that exploratory work, right? We're overconfident in the certainty of those findings, given that they were data contingent discoveries. That can be addressed by being much more explicit through things like pre-registration about what is confirmatory or planned analyses, what is exploratory or things that are responsive to the data, so that we can elevate the value of both of them. With registered reports in particular, where we have had experience with this exploratory confirmatory divide, which is present in almost all research that I do, is that the preliminary writing, so we might write a registered report submission where we have 3 or 4 exploratory studies in the submission, and then we propose 1 or 2 experiments that are the critical tests. We think we understand what's going on here. Here are our proposed designs, and those get peer reviewed, and then they make a commitment to publish regardless of outcome. So it really helps to integrate the exploratory and confirmatory process, which really are 2 parts of the research program or process overall. So thanks very much for that question. David asks, how do we mitigate the increased risk of criticism, error detection, and attack that posting one's raw data poses? I can't do it in your voice, David, but I can see you want to elaborate on your question, please.
Sure. So, I've tried over the last 4-ish years or so to I've made a commitment to myself for all new papers we put out where we own the data, so to speak, to try to put those data out publicly. And I can't say we do it every time, but we do it almost all the time. It's a lot of work, as you said, time, but above and beyond that, it scares the heck out of me every time we do it.
Yeah.
Because every time I do it, I know that I have a lot of friends out there, and I know a lot of people who don't like me so much. And I think those people who don't like me so much are probably go, let's see if I could find a mistake in his work.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And then let's accuse him of something and say it wasn't just a mistake. And I hope I'm not giving anybody ideas. But I think that that's a real issue.
Yeah.
We've found mistakes in other people's work because they've made the data public or given it to us. And I applaud them for doing it. And we try to be nice about it. We try not to, we don't accuse them of anything. We just say a mistake was made. We think it should be corrected. But I'm sure they don't enjoy that we found a mistake.
Right.
And yet you think about it, what's happening is what we're saying is to the very people who have done the right thing, you are going to get the most risk of punishment or the most risk of attack or the most risk of embarrassment. How do we mitigate that when we say, but my buddy down the hall, he or she, they're not posting their data?
It is a great question because the challenge is real, right? It is absolutely real that by exposing oneself, one is exposing oneself for good or for bad. And that in part is inevitable. The positive side of it is that it's a transitional challenge. It's not a long-term challenge. So in an environment where most people are not sharing data, then sharing data exposes one to risk, and not sharing, because it's not normative yet, is still the better play for me selfishly. As soon as you get to over the hump of this is now the norm, then not sharing the data is itself a credibility risk. So what do you mean you didn't share the data? Like, now I don't trust you because you're not being transparent. And so it reverses, but it requires getting through that transitional period where the risks, as you articulate them, are there. And we shouldn't shy away from the fact that they are there. A related one that's been a discussion in fields that are similarly going through these transitions is, okay, I pre-register all my work. I report all the things that didn't work. I can't get it published because there are people that are not doing that. And they have these beautiful papers. Like, oh my gosh, like I'm hurting myself. And it is exactly the same challenge. And so a really important part for both of these issues, the data sharing and risks of attack from that, and the constraining oneself when others might not be, is the social communication, the normative part of valuing those behaviors, of editors saying explicitly, if you pre-register, I'm going to actually be a little bit more tolerant of the messiness because I know that's actually how research happens. And if you don't pre-register, I'm going to have higher expectations because I don't know what the origins are. Likewise with data, we can understand that people are sharing their data, are willing, they're embracing the humility of, I know I have mistakes in here. I must. The work we did was hard. I am sharing it with you so that others might find that. And that being an act of credibility that is about the person, whereas at the present, we have this dysfunctional notion of finding any error is the problem, right? That's a credibility problem for the person. If we have that standard, none of us will pass the test, right? Do any of us not make errors? I bet there is at least one error, some fundamental in every paper that I've ever written. And that isn't saying that I'm sloppy. I'm careful, but I'm human and it's hard. And so we have to, please go ahead.
We have a practice in our group, which is we will not send a paper out again if it's such that we have enough control over the paper to dictate this. We will not allow a paper to be submitted until after the first statistician or data analyst has analyzed it. All of the raw data and code and tables and draft manuscript are turned over to a professional statistician in our group who then reproduces every number in every line of text, in every figure, in every table.
Yeah.
And only when they can do that do we submit. And we have never yet, not once in dozens of papers, failed to detect an error that the first analyst made. And it doesn't matter if the first analyst was us.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if the first analyst was a PhD biostatistician. The errors then tend to be small, but
Right.
they're still
They're
errors.
there. Yeah.
When it's not a professional statistician, they're often not so small.
Yeah. 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 No, great example. And then, of course, this leads into those challenges of burden. Like, oh my gosh, do we all have to now, meet the Allison Lab standard for how it is we check all of these things? That's a lot to ask, but that's the science. And if we don't have those resources, then we can cultivate a culture where me making my data, I don't have the resources you've got. Okay, so I'm going to make my data available. And if you find that error, instead of me feeling attacked by it, we should adopt what happens in the open source software community, which is I say, oh my gosh, thank you. Thanks for taking the time to help identify that error, because now I have more confidence in our findings because errors have been identified and rooted out, right? So that collaborative spirit is not easy, right? The ego and everything else is in there, but we can cultivate a better mindset about those things. Thanks very much for those comments.